Yeah, we're live. Oh, there we go. It's a little bit lighter now. Let's see if I can fix that. Dial that up a little bit. Yeah, now we're all light. Wow, I'm bright for the first time. Big night ahead. Big night ahead. That's right. We are live, and I'm a couple of minutes late. I was trying to figure out what photo to use for the thumbnail and trying to get that. Sometimes when I send it over, it's a weird thing. When I send a photo over from my phone and then I load it up, for some reason YouTube wants to invert it all the time. So when I do a thumbnail, I have to play with it on my phone and flip it over a couple of times and then resave it. And then after I do that, then it's okay. And then when I send it, if I'm doing it like right in the nick of time to get everything started, naturally that it takes a long time for it to come through and all that. You know how life is. But tonight, just recently, as a matter of fact, I put up a video of dual plane intake manifold testing that is interesting for a couple of reasons. One is that we were running. One was a big block Ford, so all the big block Ford guys are going to be happy. One was a small block Chevy, so again, not an LS, and one of them was an LS because you have to throw an LS in there. The LS is interesting because we ran a dual plane versus an EFI intake manifold. So not only is it different styles of intake ostensibly, but it's also, always the EFI carb guys like carb's better, EFI's better, blah, 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 blah. So that's an interesting test. And I like it mostly because obviously the long runner EFI truck manifold is kind of known for its torque production, much more so than other short runner manifolds. And in fact, it did as good or better than any of the EFI manifolds that I tested when I did the big intake test. And that's what this was from. This is from the 6-liter that I did it on. Because I'm trying to think back and remember when I thought that I did another dual plane test on a 5.3, but I couldn't find the dyno results. I'm pretty sure that I did. In fact, I'm thinking that the only intake that I've ever tested that would do more low speed power, and in this case, when we're talking about low speed power, if you take a look at the video, it's only down at like 3,000 RPM. But the power production there, I think, would only be bettered than the dual plane by the cross ram Holly that I did. It had, because of its runner length, it had a lot of runner length, and the dual plenum I think probably helped that too. But I think that's the only one I've seen do better than the truck manifold down low, and it did. And so I think that one would probably, and I didn't run that because that manifold actually wasn't available when I did the original intake test. That they hadn't even made that yet, and that's why it wasn't included. But when you compare the dual plane, a simple carbureted dual plane intake manifold, to even the long runner EFI intake manifold, you see something interesting. The EFI manifold does better, not because it's EFI and one of them is carbureted. In fact, I've run the carburation versus EFI on the same manifold, and the carburetor usually tends to win that, unless I run throttle body injection, where it's injecting fuel into the intake manifold like the carburetor is. And even then, I'd like to see that. I know that Brule and the Engine Masters Guide did a test on that, and maybe if you could dial in the air fuel just right. But the thing is, even with a throttle body injected, which I didn't test in this video, but even with the throttle body injection, you can't tune individual cylinders in it. So you can only get a global kind of thing, the same way that you get from the carburetor. And I would argue that I don't even know if you can do corner jetting like you can with a carburetor, but it would be interesting. And I haven't done that exact test to figure out which one was better. I would think that they would be comparable. But when you're comparing carburation to port injection on the same manifold, usually carburation wins because you're injecting fuel and you have a change in charge temperature, and that works out pretty well. But this was not that. This was just the dual plane carburetor run with a carbureted intake, run with a carburetor, and then compared it to the truck manifold. And the dual plane did better down low. It didn't do as good. It did almost the same at the very top, but through the middle part of the curve, it wasn't as good as the truck manifold. And I'm sure that that's why GM designed it. I'm sure that they never even looked at a dual plane when they were running their LS. Maybe they did. I wouldn't think so. But the other tests were also cool, like the small block and the big block Ford. And for the same reason that you run a lot of times the factories will have, especially back in the day, they would have had cast iron dual plane intake manifolds. Dual plane would be the most common because that's going to provide the best average power production. And in the RPM range that most of these factory motors are running, that's going to be the way to go, even for high RPM stuff, relatively high RPM stuff like the dual plane that they use on the DZ302 or on the 327 in the case of the small blocks, and also the LT1. All of those had high rise. Those were aluminum versions, and they had high rises if they had the hood clearance to fit that. And that's kind of the best way to go. But a lot of stuff, a lot of the lesser stuff, the lesser performance stuff, got away with basically low rise cast iron intake manifolds. Like I showed in the video, the Quadrajet cast iron dual plane intake manifold, and that's run on, it's got to be millions of small block Chevys. Same thing with a Ford. Now the Ford that I found was a really good one. I kind of wish I still had it, but it was a late 60s, but an early 460. It was a high compression version. This one happened to have been rebuilt, so we got lucky when we found this one, and it did very well. But it also had the factory cast iron intake manifold. And when we ran a back-to-back test, I thought from looking at it and not having a lot of Ford big block experience, I thought from looking at it that anything that we put on there is just going to be a huge step up and make it basically better everywhere. But that wasn't the case, and that's why testing is so cool, especially when we run it down that low. That's really beneficial, because when we run it down that low, we see kind of what's happening. We get a better idea of what's happening, and I think we get a better idea for the daily driver kind of thing. And that let's face it, that 460 was designed to power big heavy things. It's not a high RPM motor, and so it excelled at what it did. And that particular intake manifold design, that particular dual plane low rise cast iron intake manifold, worked very well. In fact, it worked quite a bit better than the YN that we tested, because they're the available big block, especially back in the day, the different intake manifolds that are available for a big block Ford. There's not a ton of them like there's much more for, I think, for big block Chevys and certainly for small block Chevys. But we ran the YN intake manifold on that, and when we put it on, I thought, well, first of all, it's aluminum, so it's already better. It doesn't weigh 5,000 pounds. Not as much as an FE Ford intake manifold, because those things are basically half the cylinder head, so those are really heavy. But it's all a cast iron intake manifold is a pretty hefty chunk, and replacing it with aluminum right away, you're going to get a gain from it being 20 or 30 pounds lighter, or whatever the difference is. But I thought after putting it on, oh, we're going to see big things here, and that cast iron intake manifold was a good bit better, especially down low. So for something that's like a 4,000 RPM, where most people would kind of be driving that big motor, I think, especially a stock one, if you have a stock camshaft in it, I think I would pick the cast iron manifold. I mean, if it wasn't so heavy and so ugly, I would be tempted just to put aluminum, but I would kind of wish they had an aluminum version of that manifold, because it worked out very, very well. And the same thing with the small block Chevy. The small block Chevy, I had to include the step up from the 2-barrel to the 4-barrel, because a lot of guys are under the misconception that if you run a 2-barrel, obviously a 2-barrel has got to have more low speed power, right? It's got good signal and it's got all that torque, and it doesn't. It just doesn't. The Quadrajet was basically better everywhere, even way down low. And honestly, if you had to, you could just run the really low speed stuff on the 2-barrel portion of the 4-barrel, and then go into the 4 barrels and do it that way if you wanted to do that. But the Quadrajet intake manifold worked very well. It was about 30 horsepower better than the 2-barrel was. And then the same thing, we tested another YN aluminum intake manifold, and I expected, and we even ran the same carburetor. We ran the same Quadrajet from Sean Murphy Inductions, which is it was a brand new carburetor, so it worked very well. And we ran that carburetor, just did the intake swap, so we didn't add a Holley 750 like we normally would. And we ran that combination, and the cast iron Quadrajet factory intake manifold did very, very well, because especially back in the day before I was dyno testing and stuff, you would put some sort of aluminum aftermarket manifold on it. Now I honestly think if we put an RPM air gap on there, that it would be better. And I've never done that on a really mild application with stock heads and the stock cam and just basically headers on a low compression small block. But it would be interesting to see what, like an RPM air gap, which is kind of our go-to dual plane intake manifold, what that does down at 2,000 or 2,500 or somewhere in that range with such a mild camshaft. Is it really better than that cast iron Quadrajet? And the other thing is, there are also aluminum versions of that low rise Quadrajet intake manifold. They had they had them on the L46s, and maybe they might have had them on the L82s. If somebody knows, they can remind me. I can't remember when I was researching all that stuff. I know that there was an aluminum version on the Corvette, and because I was trying to find one and I couldn't find one for the test, so we ended up just using a cast iron version on that. And I don't know if the aluminum. I'm told from my research that the performance of the two intake is the same. I was even told by two sources that the mold was the same. Now, I don't know if that's the case or not, but in which case then they should, if the port openings and all that stuff are the same, that they should perform the same. But it would be interesting, and I would just like to test them back to back, just so that we could go, oh no, it's actually a little bit more here, a little bit less here, whatever it was. But there is that aluminum version. Then obviously from the factory, there are the other Winters Foundry, Snowflake, LT1 high rises, and then the various different versions of the aluminum high rise that were available on the L76 and the DZ302, and a lot of different performance combinations. And a lot of those would have come with Holley carburetors too. But so the interesting thing on this, again, how well the other ones did down low, and then this begs the question. So if we look and see what they do, and look and see, particularly, I think somebody coming out with another dual plane intake manifold for a small block Chevy. I don't know how that's going to fit into the market of the 100 or so other ones that are already there. But the question is, does the market need an EFI dual plane? And I honestly think it does. We've been converting single plane intake manifolds with fuel injection on them for years, because if you could put bungs in there to run nitrous, people put bungs in there to run fuel injectors. And we've got a couple of them there at West Tech. People offer them now. They already make them and cast them and do that, and that works out well. And I've only ever seen one dual plane port injected intake manifold, that was by Speedmaster, and we weren't able to run it because it actually didn't fit on the heads that we had. Because you always have with the big blocks, the differences in the heads have an overhang for the valve cover rail and stuff. And so we just didn't want to machine it and make it work. But that's the only one I've ever seen, and I've never tested it. But I think given the power gains, an EFI dual plane, the right one, I think it should be a seller. Because if I was putting together a street motor that I wanted, was a carbureted style intake manifold on there, like let's say a small block Ford. If I was putting a small block Ford in there and I didn't want to put a throttle body injection on there, because I don't want to put a throttle body injection on there, that's just me, and I'd rather have port injection, I would want port injection on a dual plane. And unless I'm running at 6,500 or 7,000 RPM, I'm going to want a dual plane on the small block Ford more than I'm going to want a single plane. There are lots of good single planes out there, but you're always going to trade power. And I've done that test many, many times. So for a lot of applications, streetable applications, I think they need a port injected dual plane intake manifold. And I think it would be, kind of cool. Let me know what you guys think. Let's see. In Australia, we use QJet 4-barrel carbs on 253 and 308. And had a few Harrop 350 Jim Holden's 135 to 295 horsepower, and a later port EFI took years to match the power in foot-pounds. The 4-barrel stuff, with so much, it took a long time. Look at ProStock, look at NASCAR when they switched over from carburetors to fuel injection. It took a while to get things back in line. Yes, quadrojets make that noise when the secondaries open up, which I like. It's kind of cool, especially if you got to flip the air cleaner lid over. I would pay big bucks to get a 500X Caddy in my wife's Miata. That's a lot of motor. Would mechanical secondaries on a 4150 make any noticeable sound? They don't seem to make the same sound as the quadrojet does. And I don't know if that's because the way that the secondary top mounted like butterflies, that maybe they're opening up progressively or something that's changing the note of it. But it's definitely different, because I've had Holley stuff, and Holley's 4-barrel carburetors make noise, but on a mechanical secondary, when you get into the throttle, they open up at the same time. It's interesting that the factory 4-barrel intake on the Buick 4.1 liter V6 is a single plane. Yeah, that's kind of common. If you look at the 4.3 liter that I did, the intake manifold that Edelbrock supplied, it's not really a traditional single plane, but it's also not a dual plane. It's like a divided dual plane, and that's, I mean, it's like a divided single plane, and that's not really a dual plane. That's more like a divided single plane. I had a dual plane Edelbrock Performer. They sold a lot of those. Holly Street Avenger 770 jetted down with a carb spacer on a 305. Nice. 76 to 82 Cleveland 4.9. So is that like a 302 then? Carburetor had a dual plane 2V intake with a thermoquad 800, 24 US mile per gallon, highway, 188 horsepower. Q-Jet by Jim. Jim's the Q-Jet guy. So Richard did an LS swap on Facebook today. Any advice on tuning a blow-through setup? Yeah, we run when I've only done blow-through tuning on the CSU carburetor that we have, so that's the only one that I can give you information on. I start with and Kevin just told me this. He wants to start with the boost reference power valves in a certain position, and then start from there, and then change jets. And then after you've done that, and then you're running into other problems, then we start adjusting the boost reference power valves. Because the boost reference power valves can make a big change in fueling. So if you could get everything that you need with, and it depends on what you're testing them on and what you're tuning them on. Like tuning them on a centrifugal blower is going to be different than tuning them on a turbo, where the boost can kind of come on all at once. And my cousin had a 454 RV Q-Jet on his 305 5-speed Trans Am. I think it had a 400 RPM delay for secondaries to kick in. If it is oversized and there's not enough signal, the secondaries are not going to open. Let's see. I have a 360 Magnum looking to replace the stock intake manifold. Is there a good one I can use with the stock throttle body? Are you getting rid of the kegger manifold then? Take a look at I don't know if the Engine Masters testing has come out yet, but I thought that I had videos up on replacing them with the dual plane. If you replace the kegger manifold with the dual plane, you're going to pick up quite a bit of power. Mechanical carb doesn't need to be a 1-to-1 throttle opening. No, it can be a kind of a progressive deal, depending on how you bend the little arm. What is the base position of the boost reference power valve? I can't remember now what he said. I thought he said a lot of times I like to start with it flush, so it's screwed all the way out, so the part that you're screwing in is flushed with the face, and then that's a known starting point. But I think that he likes it in a turn or a turn and a half, maybe. Wondering at some point you could do a multi-stage nitrous test plate system compared to a port setup. So you want to do one like a plate versus a individual port, or do you want to do a plate that has multiple stages then versus a port that has multiple stages? When are you gonna start playing around with the newer V6s? I'm not even done playing with any of the older V6s yet, so it would have to be after that. Don't any of the Predator carbs not require boost reference? I've never seen one up close, so I don't know. Have you ever tested a Gen 1 Hemi? I have not. Westech has a Gen 2, a blown 426 Hemi that they've run. I'm converting an EFI 350 to a carb using an Edelbrock Performer intake. That's good. I don't want to mess with changing out the entire fuel system and ECU. Am I losing power over the stock setup? What year 350 is it? If it's a tune port and you're putting a dual plane intake manifold on it, you're going to pick up power. You're going to lose low speed power, but you're going to pick up power. You're going to have to do something with the distributor, though. On nitrous, I'm switching from a TBS intake manifold with a wet plate to a single plane with a wet plate. Should I expect more power on the same shot? No. Well, you might. You might not if you're injecting the nitrous through the Trailblazer SS intake manifold. You might not be getting as good a distribution as you could. As you go up in the jet size that you're using to pass through those long runner manifolds, it gets worse and worse. Distribution gets worse. What you're going to do, and I don't know what RPM running range you're running this in, but you're going to lose a lot of power through most of the curve if you go to a single plane manifold over the Trailblazer SS. What about vent tube extensions? The under boost, those definitely have an effect on the signal. We've tried those too. I have an FJ45 with a 307 in it. Any gain from swapping dual point centrifugal advance distributor to a vacuum advance? If you can get your distributor advance curve correct, then going to a vacuum advance may not do anything. A lot of times, a vacuum advance can give you more advance under cruise. And if it can do that, sometimes that can improve fuel mileage. Richard, watched your DIY turbo piping video. Thank you. I've learned a lot. Now I know what is required to run a single setup. Do you think a log manifold is the way to go versus a stock manifold? You shouldn't worry at all about flow or anything like that when you're doing your turbo setup. Just get the exhaust to the turbo. Whatever fits in there is going to work just fine. Stock exhaust manifolds work great on an LS, and you can make way into 4-digit, like mid 4-digit power stuff, maybe more than that with stock exhaust manifolds, and they work fine. A log manifold is not going to be better unless the log manifold fits better. Why don't thermoquads sound like a Q-jet? It doesn't make the same noise, and neither does a Carter. I have a 78 Camaro with an aftermarket 354 barrel with hot air style choke. Destroyed 3 trans and 1 rear end gear in 1 summer. Nice. Had to trim the gasket for the 8004. The ports were bigger than my 462 port match heads to a factory gasket back in '87. So that's in reference to the big block. James, I think it's the air door on the Q-jet. I would agree with that. That causes the noise. Thermoquads and Edelbrocks, I won't use them. What LS cam will continue to try to make more power above 6,300? There are lots and lots of cams that will do that. It depends more on a lot of other things. The camshaft isn't the thing that's holding you back from making power above 6,300. Your intake manifold could be doing that. If it's a really long runner intake manifold, you could put a ton of camshaft in it, and then it gets harder and harder to make power up at the top because the intake manifold is a 6,000 RPM intake manifold. To a lesser extent, cylinder heads are like that too. If you put really big heads on it, it will want to make power at a higher engine speed. Intake manifold runner length is a big deal, and the displacement of the motor. The camshaft that you put in a 4.8, like a 224 cam, will make power at 7,000 on a 4.8 liter. So you don't have to put nearly as much camshaft in that as you do in a 5.3 or a 6.0 or a 6.2 or 7 liter or whatever. Have you played around with port taper versus length? I have not. Almost all of the testing that I've done has just been a fixed diameter. There are multiple intakes coming out for the Godzilla. Yeah, I've seen a few of them. What would be the best intake in your opinion for setup in a classic? I don't know. I don't know anything about that motor, and I don't know what the stock intake manifold does, and I haven't seen any of the tests on any of the other ones, so I don't really know. What do you think of aftermarket manifolds for 351 Clevelands that are designed with smaller ports than the ones on the heads? Seems like you might as well call the 4V valves junk. No, that's not correct. We run smaller ports from the intake manifold to big ports on the head all the time. And for instance, we ran the RPM air gap 351 Cleveland manifold on our 400M with adapters, and the ports on the manifold were the smallest thing. That doesn't stop the manifold from working. You don't need, like, people get worried about port matching. An RPM air gap compared to a stock 351 Cleveland manifold on a 4V, even though the ports on the intake manifold are a lot smaller, I think that they're kind of between a 2V and they're like a 3V, between a 2V and a 4V, because they were designed for the Edelbrock heads, actually. But even though the manifold is smaller, it makes a lot more power than a factory big port 4V intake manifold does. Early Buicks and a few other select GM products received the 800 CFM Quadra. Everything else got the 750. The Cadillacs got that. Have you ever tested a factory cast iron high-rise big block Chevy spread bore manifold? My buddy had one on a 396 and a 63 pickup with a Holley 670 spread bore carb. I don't think I have. I don't remember. I'd have to look and see. The guys at Westac have a whole bunch of big block stuff, but I don't ever remember seeing one of those. Do you run two boost reference power valves in the CSU carburetor? The CSU carburetor has boost reference power valves on the front and the back. DV's modified stock QJet intake and Brzezinski are interesting. I don't think I've seen the modified ones. I would like to, though. Are the Holley Sniper intake manifolds worth looking at? Are you talking about the short runner fabricated sheet metal looking things? Saul, the NA manifold or NA combinations work really well. What do you think the limit would be on nitrous usage with a performer intake? The intake manifold is not going to limit the nitrous usage, not at all. Your power output, your NA power output, is going to determine and the strength and your ability to tune. The strength of the internals are going to determine what you can use, how much nitrous the motor can use. If you have a 300 horsepower small block, for instance, and you have a performer style intake manifold on it, you can't run a 600 horsepower shot on that combination because the motor won't process that. But it has nothing to do with the intake manifold. My F-150 4.6 super long runners and non-PI heads has no power above 3,500. You know who the guys that are doing amazing things with Q-jets are the guys that run like stock eliminator classes, and those guys make those things work really well. Saw a video of a 464 engine making over 1,000 horsepower using carburetor and nitrous. Yeah, we've done that. Richard, at some point, can we test header extension lengths? I've done that a lot, and their effect on power. I'm thinking 3 feet versus 6 feet versus 9 feet. If you're talking about just the collector extension length, we have like an 18-inch one and then a 42-inch one, after you go past the 42-inch one, there doesn't seem to be a big change. Have you ever seen a bolt-on port nitrous setup for an LS engine, kind of like the rec to cathedral port adapters? I haven't seen that, honestly. Maybe somebody has done that. I've seen them for some of the intake manifolds. Like I've seen the some guys, probably Nitrous Express or one of those guys, offers a setup that sandwiches in between the lid and the bottom of a Holley high ram, I think. So I've seen stuff like that. I'd like to see some testing on 6.4 liter Hemi intakes. Yep, me too. How many 4-digit runs have you put on stock LS main bolts? All of the big bang motors all have stock LS main bolts. They all have the ones that were in the motor in the 250 or 300,000 mile motor anyway. And we've done hundreds of runs on 4-digit power runs on those with turbos. And then the carnage and stuff is all when we were up at 1500. The 1965 Q-Jet 396 intake was taller than the later ones. Okay. I'm thinking that with GM, that the intake manifold usually was a function of the available hood clearance. Like the Corvette usually got the low rise stuff. And then the other applications, like maybe trucks did too, but certainly the full size stuff that didn't have hood clearance issues, those got taller intake manifolds. What is the rule with intake cam duration? 331 with the XE274, 274 versus the 228 intake exhaust cam duration. I don't know what rule you're asking about. A 228 cam has a bigger intake duration, so it would be a bigger cam than the 224. The 228 is not something I'd run in a small block Ford. I would rather run a 228 230 or 240, probably not a 240, a 228 238 maybe, or the 224 232 works really well. You have to make sure that you have enough available piston to valve clearance with the duration like that on a small block Ford. An 8-to-1 motor on high boost versus 11-to-1 motor on less boost with the same octane. I don't know about the octane question. I don't know which one of those would do better, and I don't know what your view of high boost and low boost. I don't know what any of those variables mean. The boost is worth a lot more than compression is. To give you an idea, each point of compression is worth about 3 or 4%. But a pound of boost is worth a lot more than that. So every pound of boost on any kind of reasonable motor can be 30 or 40 horsepower. You're almost never going to get that's 1 pound of boost. You're almost never going to get that from a point of compression unless you had a really, really powerful motor to start out with that was low compression. And then the other thing is, like, which one of those, I don't know which way. Like, is 1 point of compression equal to 1 pound of boost? I think it's not. I think 1 point of compression in terms of the detonation threshold is probably not just 1 pound of boost. I think it's more than that. So when you're talking about that, now you're looking at, okay, we're going to gain 3 or 4%, which could be, I don't know, 12 or 15 horsepower. And if we can go up 3 pounds of boost, that could be like 100 horsepower. So I think my feeling is that that's skewed in the direction of boost. And even if we took timing away because we have a detonation threshold with octane, I still think the gains are going to be more with boost. I've never seen anybody. I don't know if they make blow through quadrajets. I've never seen one. If anybody else has, please chime in there. I did like playing with mine was on my first Camaro. It was originally a 2-barrel car, and then I swapped my friend because he had a 4-barrel on his, and so he had the 4-barrel intake manifold, and then a 4-barrel carburetor. The intake manifold that he had was an SP2P intake manifold, and then the 4-barrel that he had was a 4150 Economaster. So it was just barely qualified as a 4-barrel, and it wasn't much of a gain, much of that big of a jump over a decent 2G, but it did make more power. But it was my first adventure in swapping things over, and I got it completely wrong. We had to take it to somebody, and they had to hook all the vacuum hoses up and stuff. But the thing that I liked about it was later on was playing with the transmission kickdowns, because I used the a little piece of metal that had a bunch of holes in it, and then we could adjust where the how the kickdown would work. So we could get into the throttle and have it drop from 3rd gear all the way down into 1st gear and get going. Then we had a shift kit in, and then it would chirp 2nd, because that's what performance oriented Camaros do. Look at the Blue Thunder 351 Cleveland intake. That Blue Thunder, they have good stuff. They have really good cylinder heads. Just picked up a 67 Mustang 289 2-barrel intake for $25. Should I use it or sell it and go with the? I think you'll be much happier with a 4-barrel intake manifold. And a 4-barrel intake manifold for a small block Ford is pretty inexpensive. In fact, you could probably go find those in the wrecking yard. You could still find some of those. Go look in the early trucks and stuff. I would, yeah, or you could just buy a new one of the offshore ones. I know you don't like cams with the same intake and exhaust duration. I actually like the torque cam that Brian Tooley sells, that 202. That one seems to work pretty well for what it's doing. I don't know that I would pick one of those higher up for a performance deal, but that one seems to work pretty well. Yes, the cheap Holley tunnel ram sniper intake manifold, are they any good, or should it go a 2-piece tunnel ram under a different name? What application is this for? Tell me what motor we're talking about first, and then I can tell you what's going on. When is the Big Bang Magnum coming? I'm probably not going to do a Big Bang on the Magnum. Edelbrocks don't have the resistance to high fuel pressure, no hot idle correction, no downshift cables or vacuum operated throttle modulators. Better off with Q-Jet or Thermoquad or 4180C. Ever run a test on maximum compression on 87 octane? No, because the thing is, the compression is not going to dictate what the detonation. It's not the only thing that's going to dictate what the detonation threshold is on 87 octane. You might have, giving, if it's 87 octane pump gas, you might have a big variation on what the 87 octane actually is if you get it. But there are so many other things that affect that, like the air temperature, the water temperature, the chamber design, the piston design. There are a lot of things that would affect it. The best way to do that would be to do that on a single cylinder test facility, like they do when they're measuring knock and they're measuring octane. I would like to see what kind of an aftermarket camshaft for a stock 85 TunePort Camaro. I've run lots of small TunePort cams, and the reason that they're going to be small is because, and you can't put a lot of times guys would think small block Chevy when they're thinking TunePort stuff, like think carbureted small block Chevy, and they put a lot of camshaft in it, and that's the wrong way to go on a TunePort motor, because a TunePort motor, especially an otherwise stock one, is never going to be making power at 6,500 RPM. It's not going to be making power at 6,000 RPM. It's going to be making peak power at 5,000 RPM. So you need to cam it accordingly. And so you're talking about a cam that's going to be like a 206, 212, or a 212, 218, somewhere in there, somewhere in the 220 or less duration, probably. And somebody brought up a point about if you put a camshaft in it, you're definitely gonna have to tune it too on your tune port. You have to tune your tune port. I've watched a bunch of videos on factory rec ports versus cathedral port heads. I'm still confused about which one is best. Are my 823s worth upgrading for high torque truck application? You have the most powerful factory head that you can have. It makes the most power. It doesn't make the most low speed power. A cathedral port head will do that. And the right other intake manifold and associated things. I don't know what the rest of your combination is, but there's no cathedral port head that makes as much power as that 823 head does. There are some that make more at 2,000, 3,000, and possibly 4,000 RPM, make more torque than that head does. So it depends on, you're going to trade something off somewhere. I ain't no punk. I have a high nickel 4-bolt main, 40 over. Clearance for a 4-inch stroke and a small block Chevy. That's a lot. I have a Ford Scat lightweight crank, 6-inch Eagle rods with Wisco pistons for sale. Everything new. The block is ready to go. 1,200. Oh, 1,250. So he's selling that combination. Safe compression for 87 varies by the motor. Newer motors are capable of 11-to-1 on 87, while older stuff can barely squeak by on 8.5-to-1. A lot of that has to do with their timing curves and stuff. On a turbo downpipe, how much does back pressure affect horsepower? My dyno tuner said I was limited because of my exhaust size is 3.5. You have a 3.5-inch exhaust on an 88 millimeter turbo. That seems small, but you should monitor back pressure to see what that is, and it will definitely hurt versus having a 4-inch or 4.5-inch exhaust on it. If you're trying to, especially if you're only running 10 or 15 pounds, you shouldn't worry about it. If you're trying to max out an 88 millimeter turbo, you need a bigger than 3.5-inch exhaust on it. Tom Nelson said if you don't have 1,800 horsepower in LA, don't bother popping your hood. I've done a lot of stuff with reprogramming chips back in the day, but that's the way that we did a lot of the Honda testing way back in the day for the race car. Have you ever tested a VGT turbo on an LS? No. I don't know how you get the VGT to function. James, you're saying that somebody had a blow through Q-jet on a Barracuda. I just have never seen one. I've never seen a company offer that, and I've never seen them advertise it or anything. Why would intake companies have ever made the super small port single plane intake manifolds like the Torquer? Well, that was their attempt at trying to get more low speed power. I think that they realized that the single plane design was limited, and it definitely hurt response. And so I think that they were trying to make those smaller to improve signal. It's still the same kind of design, and they're still going to kind of want to do the same thing. The smaller ports should help that a little bit, but then they're restricting power elsewhere. KD, you've seen blow through Edelbrocks and Q-jets. Okay, that's great. I've never seen one. Richard, was it you or Jeff Smith? You've done a Paxton blower hat Q-Jet, haven't you? Old hot rod article where the casting got cracked on a 400 Pontiac. That wasn't me. I've never run a Pontiac, so I know right off the bat, and I don't ever remember trying to blow through a Q-Jet. I'm trying to think if we tried blowing through an Edelbrock carburetor on the V6, and I think that it worked for low boost, maybe with really big jets in it, but would not be the way to go for having to drive around. Since my Cadillac 500 has too much torque for a 2,690 pound 83 Ranger, I can install 6-to-1 compression ratio pistons, run 10 pounds of boost with an intercooler on pump premium. Why would you want to go down to 6-to-1? I want to see how much nitro 305 can take till it throws a rod through the intake. Why does it have to go up through the intake? It's probably not going to go that direction. I've seen people enclose carburetors, and we've done that with lots of carburetors where you have the Paxton had them and Vortec had them. They had the carburetor enclosures. Then the carburetor is just a carburetor. Then it's not a blow-through carburetor anymore because everything is pressurized. You're not just pressurizing part of the carburetor and not the bowls and stuff. Well, I guess you are kind of pressurizing the bowls because it's got the but the everything outside of the carburetor is also pressurized. So the carburetor acts more like the carburetor does NA when you have it enclosed. The problem with having them enclosed that we always saw was it's kind of a pain to take everything apart when there are 15 or 20 bolts holding everything on. You also have to run. We had to run the lines through the enclosure. We still had to boost reference the regulator, but we could run standard carburetors in the enclosure, and they didn't have to be blow-through carburetors. Mike, what are your thoughts on the Holley Sniper Low Pro versus a 4500 single plane with EFI? How far behind? Well, Mike, just go look at if you want to see what's going on, go look at the LS3 intake test. I have that. You can kind of compare those two. Be cool to see some testing on LLSR cams versus hydraulic LS stuff. Are you talking about solid roller stuff? I'm probably not going to do that. What happened to carb boxes? Are they too expensive? I think that the Vortec guys still offer them. Banks did some stuff too, yeah. If I shave my head to 23,000, should I go short? You might have to go shorter push rods. It depends on where you are in the range of the push rod right now. I've seen inline 4-barrel carbs for sale here in Sacramento. He wanted $10,000. Wow. Was it the Autolite stuff? Those are really cool. I mean, they're not $10,000 cool, but they are really cool. What do you think maximum RPM on a high-performance 1970 Shelby dual plane for an FE would be? Well, a dual plane intake manifold is like a 6,500 or lower That's going to kind of be where it's going to want to make power. And again, it's going to depend on what displacement that is and how good the heads flow and all that. But those are normally 6,500 or less. Yeah, it was an Autolite. Those are really cool, and those are big money now. The crossboss intake manifolds for small blocks. The guys at Westech have a customer that comes in and runs stuff, and he's run a couple of those, and they're amazing, and they made really good power. Somebody used to sell a twin 390 tunnel ram with the twin 390 carburetors on it. I remember that. They also had 450s on them, and then 600s, I think. Cross draft Weber 45 DCOEs. So a cross ram on there. I should show you some of the intakes that we did. I've done a cross ram on a LS, but it had Weber looking EFI on it instead, but they look like exactly like DCOEs though. I've never seen a dual plane that wants to run at 7,500 unless the motor is really, really small. And most FEs, if a guy's talking about a 427, it's not that small. A DZ302 will rev to 7,500 with a dual plane on it, but I don't think that it would be making peak power there. Woody's out. Yeah, you're talking about a 427 with a dual plane on it. It's not a 7,500 RPM motor. How did the cross ram setup do on the top? It did really, really well. Some of the cross rams that I've run, like the Speedmaster stuff, is really long, and it's just the runner length is just too long, so it wants to make power down low. Let's all support Richard with some likes. That's right. We didn't even have our poll either for tonight, right? I have I went on Fiverr and had somebody do a new logo for me, so it's pretty cool. I'm going to be using that for T-shirts and other things too, so it will be good. So I'm trying to get stuff done. Let's get some more questions up there. I could come up with another poll maybe. It doesn't run anymore. A 5XL. Barry Grant did some inline ones too, and he did some tri-powers and a couple of different things. Okay, here we go. So the poll is a for a 427 big block Chevy, is the tri-power induction system better than the single 4-barrel, Winters aluminum high-rise intake manifold that they used on the L72 version of that 427? which one of those is better? Is the tri-power better, or is the single 4-barrel better? I know which one I'd rather have. Richard, what do you think the safe power limit is for a 4.85357 bone stock on pump gas? I don't know about the pump gas. I don't do limits on pump gas. You can certainly run, I don't know, 14, 15 pounds probably on a just otherwise stock motor. You're gonna have to change the fuel pump. You're gonna have to change the fuel injectors. You're gonna have to tune it. That's assuming that you don't put a camshaft and that kind of stuff in it, but you're gonna have to tune it because it's turbocharged. You definitely need an intercooler. Richard, what's up? Would you like to see my Turbo LS build? Yeah, just send me a photo over or whatever. The tuning the carburetors with the carb inside the carb enclosure is kind of a pain. I mean, once you get it and it's right, then it's okay, but it is a little bit more problematic than I like. That's the thing I like about running the CSU carburetor with just a bonnet on top of it. At least when we go to do, which we do a lot of tuning on the carburetor stuff. When you're going to change the position of the boost reference power valve or go to change jets, you have to take that. You just have to take the bonnet off, and it's kind of nice. And you take the bowls off and stuff, and change jets or change the position of the power valve. But with the bonnet, you have to take the lid off and take the carburetor, do all kinds of stuff. So it's a lot more work like that. But it's nice that you can use a standard kind of carburetor. The tri-power is more efficient. Yeah, Dean, I knew it was Jeff Smith. I knew that I hadn't run a Pontiac. The tri-power of my 421 Pontiac was insane. I do like tri-powers. They look really cool. Thinking of boosting my Honda XR500. That's a really good idea, I think. I voted no. It actually registering my vote because it showed when I voted no, it switched over to yes. Uh-oh. Tri-power is a good setup, but the 4-barrel was stronger, especially the L88 manifold. Well, we're not talking about an L88. We're just talking about the L72. We're not even talking about the L89 aluminum head option. We're just talking about the L72. And then I don't remember what the designation was for the tri-power motor. Does anybody know what that was? Wait, how do we send you a picture? You can send it to my email address. And if you've been here a whole bunch, you see me put my email address up all the time. Hard getting the tri-powers in sync. Richard, switching to a Holley EFI with Performer RPM or go single plane. Your choice of intake manifold is going to be RPM dependent. If you are running high RPM, then a single plane, and if you're running 6,500 or lower or whatever for most applications, a dual plane. And then also, how well do those throttle bodies do if you're running, the electronic fuel injection throttle bodies? How well do they do with a dual plane, and how well do they do with a single plane? I can't answer which one they do better with because I'd have to test it. I built a Pontiac 389 tri-power for a 67 GTO. It was a good engine. The tri-power on the big block Corvette, the one that I'm talking about, was the 435 horse option. And the single 4-barrel, the L72, was 425. But did they really do that? They were wanting people to buy the tri-power stuff. What cam would you use on the TBI, small block 350 and a heavy RV? Something really small, but you're gonna have to tune it and make sure that you'll be able to tune it on a TBI. No dual plane intake and beat a Performer RPM. Poly EFI on an air gap would be great. You just have to build the ports for it. Okay. Okay, guys, let's see how our poll is doing. We've got 2 minutes. So, is the 427 Chevy tri-power induction better than a dual plane? We're like at 59% on the no, so it's basically 60-40, 59-41. It looks like we're now 52-4 or 58-42. It's vacillating back and forth. I like the tri-powers, and I think that when you pop the hood on something, that shows a lot better than the single 4-barrel does, because let's face it, a single 4-barrel, either a big block or a small block, even though they work better than the other stuff, more than likely, people just say wow when they see that. Same thing with a tri-power Pontiac. A fuely small block compared to a single 4-barrel small block. Anybody that raced used the single 4-barrel because it was better, and they understood it was easier to tune, and you could get fuel to it all the time, and it was probably a better combination. But if you open up the hood and you have a fuel Yvette, that's pretty cool. Or a 57 Chevy or whatever. Yeah, the reason I ask is because I had a tri-power Corvette for, I don't know, less than a week, I think, maybe a week, maybe 2. The Ford FE tri-power looks cool. They do, and a guy came out of the Silver State, and they had a Camaro and an El Camino with 390 tri-power motors. Ford tri-power motors, of all things, that were swapped in a Camaro. It's the only time I've ever seen it. My wallet tells me to buy the GT45 for my LS2. Yeah, if you're only wanting 700 or 750 horsepower, that will work. There are probably bigger, I think that there are bigger, inexpensive turbos out there that you could pick that would be a better choice for your 6-liter. Okay, so we're going to stop because I've got to get going. We'll stop our poll at a whopping 59-41. So it looks like people are going the dual plane 4-barrel route. So is a Chevy 427 tri-power induction better than a dual plane? 59% said no, and 40% said yes. So there were 76 votes. 76 votes out of 155 people? Man, come on, guys. I always wanted to put a real 427 in a vet, a side oiler. Wow. Ford shots fired. It would be cool if Holly made a triple 2-barrel top for the high ram. Yeah, that would be good. 1967 427 tri-power is taller than the 68 or 69 because of less of hood clearance. Okay, that's cool. I didn't know that. Cool, guys. I got to get going. Thank you all once again for showing up. We'll come up with maybe the next poll for tomorrow night will be I'll show you guys the new logo, and you guys can tell me yes or no. Do you guys like it, or does it need to be modified? We'll talk about that tomorrow. Always good stuff. If you guys have not, make sure to go to check out the dual plane intake manifold. Let me know Carb versus EFI, and then obviously the stock stuff versus the aftermarket stuff. It's all good stuff. Dyno stuff is always good. Thanks for showing up. I'll see you all tomorrow.